We're looking at Michael Ray's response to the problem of divine hiddenness, the idea that it seems like some people want to hear from God, seek after God, but God is silent or in some way hidden. And in part one, we're looking at Schellenberg's arguments, and then in broad strokes, some of Ray's responses. And we're talking about J.L Schellenberg's arguments, and Ray takes these arguments as a starting point. So Ray summarizes the various arguments that Schellenberg has presented over the years in his writings and condenses it down into an argument that goes like this. Okay, first premise, if a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who's always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. So it seems like if we do have a loving God, especially a perfectly loving God, then that God is always going to be open to having a personal relationship with anyone who seeks after him. So if somebody wants to have a relationship with God, they will be able to do so. And if there exists a God who's always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. In other words, if anyone believes that God exists, it's not their own fault. It's not as if they've been resistant to believing in God. There is some other thing going on why they don't believe in God. But it's not as if they've been resisting this belief on their own. We'll say much more about this later. And third, if a perfectly loving God exists, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. So we're just taking the first two premises and running a hypothetical syllogism here and putting them together. And we have the idea that if we have a perfectly loving God, there isn't going to be someone who, through no fault of their own, not resisting to God, does not end up believing in God. Now, four, Schellenberg argues, as a matter of fact, however, some finite persons are or have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. So some people do not believe that God exists, and it's not because of resistance on their own part. And from there, we conclude that no perfectly loving God exists. And if no perfectly loving God exists, then God does not exist. So of course, we conclude that God does not exist. Now, one of the criticisms that Ray brings is significantly related to how the argument is presented. And notice that Schellenberg uses the aspect of hiddenness as captured by the thesis of non-resistant non-belief. And so Ray is focusing in on that aspect, and he is eventually going to reject premises 2 and 3, those connections, especially in premise 2, that if there is a God that's always open to a personal relationship, then no one would have non-resistant non-belief. Ray argues that that is in fact false. And so Schellenberg's argument being based on that, obviously, and needing premise 2 to succeed, will ultimately fail according to Ray because of that. Now, before we look at the arguments for why he rejects 2 and therefore 3, let's consider some other things that Ray says. For one, regarding premise 4, this idea that there are in fact some finite persons who are or have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief into relation to that premise that God exists, Ray concedes this. He says, okay, for the sake of my arguments, I'm not going to reject this claim, but he does have serious doubts about whether or not this claim is actually true. Now, one of the problems here is this in order for it to be true or show that it's true, you have to have a really good understanding of an individual's psychology. You have to be able to say of an individual that they are non-resistant in their non-belief. And non-resistance seems to me, at least, to be a vague term, something that might be on a scale to, absolutely, completely resistant to the idea that God exists, and militantly atheist and completely unwilling to consider any reason why God might exist. Maybe that's being resistant. But of course, non-resistance, it's how, if you're not like that, then are you non-resistant? It's not clear. And again, the problem is has to do with someone's inner psychology. How non-resistant are they? And sometimes we might even be self-deceived about being resistant when we think we're not being resistant. So this could happen with any other beliefs or any other ideas as well. So certainly, say someone who, when it comes to political beliefs, and they are strongly on the left, but they say they're not resistant to political beliefs that are right-leaning, and yet maybe as soon as they hear somebody start to provide reasons for a right-leaning political belief, they shut them off unknowingly. They just automatically, they're not really going to evaluate the argument. They're immediately going to try to find flaws in the argument. So maybe they, from their own perspective, they perceive themselves as being non-resistant, but in fact, they're not. And so this is a very challenging premise to affirm and evaluate. I think in conversations with Ray, it seems like he leans toward rejecting premise 4, but that's not part of his argument. That's not part of his response to Schellenberg. So instead, what Ray rejects are premises 2 and 3, that connection, the if-then connections between God being open to a relationship and being perfectly loving, and there not being any non-resistant non-believers. Now, general responses. In part 2, we're going to look at the arguments that Ray provides that he thinks gives you good reasons to think that premises 2 and 3 fail. But in general, he also thinks that, look, the argument is set up so that it's addressing what we might call the philosopher's God, kind of a generic God with the omni attributes. But Ray says it's really important to talk about an individual's particular beliefs. And Ray is a Christian, so he's specifically interested in Christian beliefs. And he says part of the Christian doctrine about God is that God is transcendent. That is, God is wholly other than us in some way, and we have a limitation in our capacity to understand God. So since God is transcendent, we do not have enough knowledge about what divine love really is in order to make the argument work, in order to draw out those if-then connections. So that's one of the general responses. Now, I'm not going to explore that thoroughly in this series of videos, but that is something that Ray thinks ought to be taken very seriously and is problematic for the hiddenness problem. Another general response of Ray is to say that, God is actually not that hidden. God is present to those who seek him. Now, Ray would hesitate to use male pronouns here. In fact, he does not use male pronouns in reference to God. That's my insertion. So I take responsibility for having done that. But in any case, God is present to those who seek God, especially those who have a concept of God. So the idea here is that Ray makes an analogy with other people. We don't have direct contact with minds of other people. So we just have, contact with their physical body, but not with themselves, their mind directly. And he says it's somewhat similar to God. So we have awareness of revelation, and that can be through nature, and it could be through scripture. And we have those available to us. And actually, because of these things, God is not that hidden and is revealing himself to us in multiple ways if we're just open to that. So in another aspect, then, there are problems of Schellenberg's argument. So he's going to criticize especially premises 2 and 3, and it's really premise 2. If you get premise 2, then the rest of the argument falls. And so what we're going to do in part 2 is look at 3 different arguments of Ray as to why he thinks premises 2 and therefore also 3 falter.